Welcome, everybody. My name is Jessica Lang, and I'm the Interim Dean of the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences, and I am delighted to welcome you to this evening's event entitled Climate Change, Resilience, and Opportunity. Today, the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences is proud to introduce the first program in our new series of events designed to confront the repercussions of climate change called We Are Climate Action. A multi-tiered initiative, We Are Climate Action plans to amplify the need to raise campus-wide awareness and action by generating greater involvement in educating the campus community on creating a safe, more sustainable environment. The initiative will include a speaker series, awareness through arts and cultural events, and working with academic departments to educate the campus community on the scope of the challenge. Today's program focuses on the economic impact of climate change and how the legislative policies introduced by the new Biden administration can change the quality of life in America. In April, We Are Climate Change series will collaborate with the Michigan Gallery's Critical Ecology on Film virtual series. The Michigan series features 4 films scheduled from April 8th through April 29th. The film program will tackle critical questions concerning climate change, interspecies communication, nuclear power, and privatization of the commons. Each film screening will be followed by a conversation. The Climate Academic Initiative is supported by a grant that was given to us by a very dear colleague and friend, Professor Susan Locke, a member of the faculty of the Psychology Department at the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences. In addition, Professor Locke has made a gift to support a team-taught seminar, the Locke Seminar, which brings together environmental studies and art. It is directed by Professor Emily Johnson, an assistant professor of journalism. It's now my pleasure to introduce my wonderful colleague, Professor Mindy Engel-Friedman, who's on the faculty of the Psychology Department. Professor Engel-Friedman has long been engaged with climate change and environmental sustainability. She's the chair of the Baruch College Task Force on Sustainability that launched in 2008, and she's a member of the Baruch College Climate Change Faculty Seminar. She has brought faculty and students into her efforts to advance Baruch's commitment to environmental and climate change initiatives, and has been instrumental in adopting better environmental practices at the college and so in the world. Mindy, thank you for all you've done for our community and for leading us to greater awareness and commitment to the world that we occupy, hopefully with ever increasing respect. I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Dean Lang, for your lovely introduction and for making the Weissman School of Arts and Sciences a hub and We Are Climate Action, a platform for cutting-edge climate change policy and research communication within Baruch and beyond. It's an honor to have our august panel with us today. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Professor Lin Pang. Lin Pang is the Krell Chair, Professor in Finance at Baruch's Zicklin School of Business. Professor Pang's diverse research interests cover social finance, behavioral finance, market structure, and ESG investing. She has won numerous research and teaching awards. Her research has been published in leading economics and finance journals and featured in the press. Her latest research on designing CEO incentive contracts to promote corporate social responsibility was funded by the United Nations sponsored Principle of Responsible Investing, the world's leading proponent of sustainable investment. Professor Pang serves as an associate editor and is an editorial board member for leading academic journals. Professor Pang received her MS from Wesleyan University and her doctoral degree in finance from Duke University. She has been a visiting professor at leading universities, including Princeton and Columbia. Please help me welcome Professor Lin Pang.
Thank you so much, Mindy, for the wonderful introduction, but I'm especially grateful for you to have this wonderful opportunity to moderate this very important webinar on this extremely important topic, right? So, as you have mentioned, my research has been focusing on corporate governance strategies to promote long-term sustainability. So therefore, I am absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to talk to the three extraordinary panelists who are leaders in climate-related policy, data and analytics, as well as on the climate risk of financial markets. So climate change, we're all here because we believe climate change is real and affects all of us. It affects the incredible species such as the snow leopards, the polar bears, the coral reefs that my children love. It affects agriculture, the coffee that you drink every morning, and our food supplies. It affects water and air that we drink and breathe. It triggers disastrous wildfires and devastating winter storms that we have seen in the last couple of years in California and just recently in Texas. So climate change is extremely important. It could affect the lives of millions of people. It impacts the bottom lines of many corporations, and it could threaten the stability of the financial system. So therefore, we're extremely lucky to have our distinguished panelists to share their wealth of knowledge and their insights on interdisciplinary climate engagement and the potential impact of the Biden administration's climate agenda. So the plan is for our webinar today is that I will start the panel with a quick introduction of the panelists, and then I will ask our panelists to speak about the key issues and the challenges that they face in their area, as well as some other questions. So the panel will run for about an hour, followed by a short Q&A session in the end. So with this, I would like to have the honor of introduce our esteemed panelists, Leonardo Martinez-Diaz, Sarah Menker, and Bob Litterman. So Leonardo is the panel's policy expert. He is a senior advisor to Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, also known as the Climate Czar. So previously, Leo served as the Global Director of the Sustainable Finance Center of the World Resources Institute, where he focuses on helping the private sector incorporate climate risk into financial decision-making. Okay. Before that, Leo served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury for Energy and Environment, where he directed the Treasury's domestic and international work on climate finance and participated in the Paris Agreement negotiations. So in addition, a lot of our students in the audience have also are very familiar with Leo because of his recent book with Alice Hill. The title is Building a Resilient Tomorrow, How to Prepare for the Coming Climate Disruptions. So the book offers an extremely insightful and practical guide that focuses on solutions that are currently being deployed around the globe. Okay. So our next panelist is Sarah Menker. Sarah is our data and analytics guru. She is the founder and CEO of Grow Intelligence, a software company that uses artificial intelligence and predictive modeling to forecast global agriculture. She is also a trustee of the Mandela Institute for Development Studies and a trustee of the International Center for Tropical Agriculture. She was named a Global Young Leader by the World Economic Forum, and she's also a fellow of the African Leadership Initiative of the Aspen Institute. Okay, and just one thing I would like to also mention, Sarah is actually also extremely influential on social media. Her TED Talk, a global food crisis maybe less than a decade away, have been watched for over 1.5 million times. Now turning to Bob. Bob is extremely well-known Wall Street veteran. He's the chairman of the risk committee of the World Wildlife Fund. He's also the founding partner of Kepos Capital, a New York City-based systematic global macro firm. Prior to Kepos, he spent 23 years at Goldman Sachs and became partner and head of the firm's risk management. I've heard of Bob's name for a long time because together with the Nobel laureate Fisher Black, Bob developed the famous Black Litterman Global Asset Allocation Model, which has become one of the most standard models widely used by investors around the world to optimize portfolios. In particular, I would like to mention that Bob has recently finished chairing the historical Cftc report, Managing Climate Risk in the US Financial System. This is really one of a kind because it's the first bipartisan work on climate change and climate risk. It was commissioned by the CFTC's Climate-Related Market Risk Subcommittee, which Leo and Sarah were also members. Okay, so as you can see, and maybe I am biased, but I believe the Leo, Sarah, and Bob panel is the perfect combination to discuss interdisciplinary climate engagement. So my first question to the panelists is to ask them to share their insights on what's happening in their respective areas and what are the major trends. So I will first start with Leo. On President Joe Biden's first day in office, he kept his word, rejoining Paris Agreement and pledging sweeping action to curb the climate crisis. And in particular, right this week, President's special climate envoy, John Kerry, is currently on a trip to Europe to relaunch Washington's commitment to the fight against climate change. So Leo, you have led some of these international collaborations in the past, including actually indeed the Paris Agreement during your time under the Obama administration. So now, as a senior advisor to Secretary Kerry, could you speak about the climate priorities of the new administration? What's the administration's international climate agenda? And also, what are its domestic climate initiatives? And how are we going to implement these initiatives and agenda?
Thank you very much. Can you hear me all right?
Mm-hmm.
First of all, it's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me to talk to your students, your fellows, your staff. It's a real pleasure to be able to start speaking to the audiences outside government after being inside this bubble for a few weeks now, very intense. Let me start by saying it's really exciting. It's a very exciting moment in climate policy. Obviously the last 4 years have not been particularly productive in this space, and we have a lot of room to make up. There's a lot of progress that needs to occur, and this year is very important. Of course, you have the Glasgow climate negotiations in November. We hope this will be a very important milestone on the road to increased ambition. It's also an important year because countries are going to be preparing and submitting their revised emissions commitments, their so-called NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, including the United States. And so we're hoping that those commitments will be building on the ones that were submitted last time 5 years ago, and will help lead a way towards what we are now calling the net zero by 2050 goal, which is really what is, according to the scientists, required to help us keep the world's temperatures under 2 degrees and to keep the 1.5 degree goal of the Paris Agreement on the table. So that is why this year is going to be so important. For President Biden, this is one of the top 3 issues of his entire government. And it's actually quite well connected to his other priorities. One of those, of course, being the economy and helping push the US out of the current economic crisis led by the pandemic. And climate action is very well suited to that, because by helping invest in climate solutions, including emissions reductions, energy efficiency, overhauling and improving our transportation systems, we'll be generating jobs that are high quality, in many cases unionized, and well-paying, and that will help pull the economy as well as helping us meet some of those targets for emissions reductions. So those 2 priorities of the new administration are actually quite mutually supporting. And then the third priority of government, of course, has to do with equity. both in terms of addressing structural racism as well as other types of structural inequality. And here again, climate action is important because, especially resilience, which of course is one of the topics, central topics we'll be discussing here, because it really addresses the fact that many historically marginalized populations and groups are also on the front lines of the impacts of climate change. And as a result, the agendas of equity and climate action here can really align very effectively. And so we are trying our best to ensure that all of these, we're making progress not just on all three fronts, but that we're actually connecting all three priorities together. So very, very exciting time, and one in which, by the way, it's not just government that is pulling this train. Over the last 4 years, perhaps as a result of the federal government's absence, I think the rest of society reacted. And instead of saying, well, don't worry, the federal government has us covered, people realized that all of us have a role in this effort. And you saw this incredible cascade of effort from local governments, from private companies, from citizens and many different kinds of groups, from civil society to the press and the media. And so that has really helped to create, solidify this commitment that it's not just a government objective, but it's really a whole of society process that's going to be needed. In terms of the priorities for the administration, so obviously this is only going to be month two really of the administration, but already there are some important signals that I want to highlight. Aside from the Paris Agreement rejoining, which you pointed out, a whole array of work has now been commissioned by the White House, and we're all working on that now. A lot of that is summarized in the executive order the president issued on January 27, and it essentially gives us a bunch of homework in the government. Some of that is going to be domestic, headed by Gina McCarthy, who's serving as the National Climate Advisor and is leading the domestic components of this work. A lot of it will have to do with how do we get our policies and our practices in order to be able to meet some ambitious emissions reduction targets. Importantly, there's a creation of the National Climate Task Force, which will involve a number of heads, cabinet secretaries, and other agency leaders. And among other things, that task force will be responsible for the planning and implementation of actions to increase resilience to the impacts of climate change. So you will see some action coming straight from that in the domestic context. I would also point out, given Sarah and Robert and Bob are on the call here, there's also some homework for us to develop a report on ways to expand and improve climate forecasting capabilities and information products for the public. There's a very clear sense that if we don't understand the risk, we can measure that risk, we cannot manage it. And the federal government sits, as I point out with Alice in the book, on top of a huge amount of climate data and information, but oftentimes it's not readily usable by, especially by folks who don't have a room full of PhDs to interpret that data and to crunch it. And so the federal government is going to be looking at ways to increase access to that type of insight. And let me speak about the international side as well. That's really my side of the house. That's what Secretary Kerry is responsible for. The executive order also calls on for the development of a climate finance plan. This will be a plan that helps us think through strategically the bilateral and multilateral efforts that we undertake as a government to help support adaptation and resilience abroad. And that's programming through the U.S. Agency for International Development. It's what we do through the multilateral development banks, like the World Bank. It's what we do through our different agencies that work overseas. And of course, they'll be doing work on mitigation as well as adaptation. But we really want to focus a lot on resilience and adaptation this year. It's very clear that countries are badly in need of stronger programming here to help build up their own capabilities to manage climate risk. And in the context of the current pandemic and the economic and fiscal crunch that many countries are under, it's going to be especially important to make sure that they continue to invest in climate action, even while there's these other very pressing priorities associated with the pandemic. So this is all to say we are working very hard and firing on every cylinder here to try to move this forward. But that it's not just a federal effort. The efforts that have been started in communities across the country, in companies across the country, have to continue alongside, and together we will be able to meet this challenge.
Okay, so that's really wonderful news to us, Leo. Thank you so much for bringing us, about what's happening in all these fronts, both domestic and international. So I'm going to take the next set of questions to Bob. So Bob, the CFTC Climate Risk Report was just published about 6 months ago. And as a chair, you actually formally delivered, although virtually, delivered the report to the CFTC's Market Risk Advisory Committee just 2 weeks ago. So could you please share with us some kind of the behind the scene process that led to this report? Why did the CFTC commission this report? And who are the parties involved, and how were you able to reach consensus? And also, in your opinion, what are the most biggest takeaways from this report?
Sure. Well, thank you very much, Lynn, and thank you to Baruch College for sponsoring this event. It's a pleasure to be here, and especially with my colleagues Leo and Sarah, who were helping with the report. This report was pretty special. It started in June of 2019 with some hearings before the Market Risk Advisory Committee of the CFTC, the Commodity Futures Trading Commission. And each of the commissioners, there's 5 commissioners that head the CFTC, and each one of them is a sponsor of a subcommittee or of a committee, in this case, the Market Risk Advisory Committee, and the sponsor was Commissioner Rostin Benham, who is now the acting chairman of the CFTC. And I think it was really quite remarkable and good foresight for him to bring this issue in front of the MRAC. And there were a number of experts who testified. I wasn't there. This is back in June of 2019, but it's all recorded. And so I was able to watch the video. And it was a nice hearing. And afterwards, I have to give the CFTC Commission some credit here. When the Fed and the SEC and Treasury were, I think, a little bit afraid to take up what they viewed as a controversial topic under the previous administration, the CFTC was willing to move forward. And so I give them and the MRAC and Commissioner Benham a lot of credit for then setting up our subcommittee. And they did it in a very, I would say, intelligent way. It was very bipartisan from the beginning. They thought very carefully about the mandate that they would give us. And there were a number of characteristics that really, I think, led to our success. First of all, it was a very broad set of stakeholders that was added to the subcommittee. In fact, usually I'm told that when these advisory subcommittees are set up, you might get half a dozen or a dozen interested individuals who volunteer, usually inside Washington types. In this case, there were 70 people who volunteered. And we ended up with about 34 members on the subcommittee, and they were really pretty carefully selected by Commissioner Benham and his chief of staff, David Gillers, who really was also very instrumental in our success. And well, Leo is one of the representatives, Sarah is another. We had representatives from insurance companies, banks, lots of different types of companies, ag companies like Sarah, data companies. Sarah's also a data company, oil companies, and lots of academics, lots of representatives of environmental NGOs. And we got together. The first couple of meetings were in person, then we went virtual. We were given a mandate to reach consensus right from the beginning. That was an important part of it. And that is, Lynn, if you think about it, kind of a high bar, because it means that every individual on the committee has, a vote that they can say no, and they can prevent consensus from being reached. But the commissioner was very clear. He wanted us to get to consensus, and eventually we did that. It was not easy. We early on discussed some of what you might consider the critical issues. For instance, do we need to price carbon? And everyone on the committee early on said, of course, we need appropriate incentives to reduce emissions. Another issue that people might have thought would be controversial was disclosure. And everyone on the committee said, no, we understand that material risks have to be disclosed. That's not a surprise. And so, there were early indications that we could reach consensus. We just kept pushing on every dimension. And by the way, I want to give a shout out here to Leo. He was our secret weapon, because when we did come, there were a couple of, let's call it, difficult issues where coming to the table, people had very different points of view. And so we set up a process with Leo in charge of trying to negotiate and come to an agreement. And he did, obviously in retrospect, a masterful job, because we did get there. And I think getting there is really very important. And it made this report much more impactful than it otherwise would have been, because it sent a clear message to the US government and to our domestic audience, as well as to the international audience that Leo is now working with. And the message was very clear that this is not controversial. Climate change is something that we all agree on, both the issue, the problem, that it's real and that we have to address it, and even more important, how to address it, both in terms of the responses that the regulators need to take. And also, we weren't afraid to give an assignment to the US Congress. We said, recommendation number one, you have to put a price on carbon. We said, this is the single most important, recommendation we can make. And it's urgent. And it's urgent because those of us who have been in the financial markets, especially a quant like myself, we understand how efficient these markets are. I mean, I've been spending a career using mathematical models and trading at high frequencies as well as low, trying to find inefficiencies in the market and take advantage of them. Those are opportunities. And so as investors like myself try to do that, we push the market toward efficient prices and equilibrium. And so that's what, we've been trying to do. And it's having impacts. But the market's only efficient given the incentives that we have. Obviously, investors, asset owners, businesses are all trying to make profits given the prices and the wages that we see in the market. And those are the incentives in a market economy. And when they're aligned in the right direction, we all make decisions that make sense, that move us in the right direction. And when they point in the wrong direction, as they do today, they're not aligned with the externalities embedded in emissions. When they're not aligned, as they aren't today, then the investment flow goes in the wrong direction. And so there's two key things that investors and participants in the financial markets have to do. One is risk management. We have to protect our own balance sheets, and we have to recognize the emerging risks that are coming from climate change. And then the second thing we have to do is we have to channel an incredible, large scale increase in capital and infrastructure and money toward building the net zero economy. And we haven't started that yet. We've got to get started immediately. In the meantime, the risk is increasing every day, and we don't know how much time we have. So this is a very urgent problem. And the fact that the entire US financial, system basically came together and agreed on this is pretty important. And it sends a really important message. I think that Leo and the entire administration now has, the clear signal that they need, that we have to move forward, that you have unanimity here. The financial market participants are at the center of the economy. And, we can talk about the risks that are out there. There's many, many types of risks. We've seen them recently with the freeze in Texas, with the wildfires in California. These weather-related events are only going to come more often, and they're going to be bigger, and the losses are going to grow over time. We address these through insurance, through reinsurance, through government backstops, and that insurance is only going to get more expensive over time, and those backstops may not be available in the future. And so as these losses mount and get bigger and aggregate, it's eventually going to become a systemic problem for the financial system. We have to be ready for it, and that means we have to start right now.
Thank you so much, Bob. That was actually quite extraordinary coordination of effort across, all different players in the economy, right? So we have consumers are ready, investors are ready, corporation, business communities are ready, right? So we all want to take more active role in mitigating climate risk and engage in this process. So that's
well, yeah, Lin, if I may jump in here, and I'm sorry to, I know we want to jump to Sarah, but you're right. There has been a tremendous follow-up to this report in terms of support from the business community, the Chamber of Commerce, the Business Roundtable, the National Association of Manufacturers. 2 weeks ago, it was pretty amazing. The American Petroleum Institute said, well, it was reported in the Wall Street Journal, they're going to support market approaches to reducing emissions. I mean, wow. if the industry that's right in the crosshair says, yeah, no, this is what we have to do, there aren't too many people who don't get it. At the Climate Leadership Council, we have support from everyone from ExxonMobil to the World Wildlife Fund and everyone in between. Now we can count the American Petroleum Institute as well.
Wow, that's really wonderful and amazing. Yeah, so the time is now, right?
The time is now. It should have been 20 years ago, but we can't change history.
Indeed, yes. Okay, that's great. So I'm gonna turn next to Sarah. Okay, so Sarah, you were a commodity and options trader at an elite Wall Street firm before, right? But now you are building the Bloomberg equivalent for the global agriculture supply chain, and you've also devoted yourself in climate risk analytics, right? So could you please share with us what made you switch career and what's happening in your company, Grow Intelligence?
Yeah, well, it's a tough act to follow after Leo and Bob, but thanks for having me and for having me join this panel. And I always feel like every time I hear people speak, I realize how much more I have to learn. I ended up on Wall Street almost by accident. I was an international student that got a scholarship and moved to America from Ethiopia for college. And especially back, when I was in college, there were not that many jobs you could get that would actually sponsor a visa to stay in America. Finance was one of them, consulting was another. So it's also one of those things where the range of opportunities that international students have in America today in terms of where they can go career-wise was very different for people like myself. You either went and did a PhD or you ended up in a handful of careers that were willing to sponsor a visa. And so my kind of foray into Wall Street was, it paid money and it gave me a visa. and I happened to sort of join, at a time when commodity markets were not that popular. And nobody really was thinking of being a commodities trader. If you joined a firm like Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs, I mean, they had very great divisions, but that's not where everybody was sort of fighting to go. But I was always very curious about the physical world and, knew what oil was, knew what power was. And it was just, it was obviously connected to political economy. As an African, I always cared sort of about economic development a lot. And so I kind of stumbled into it. And then I ended up working with people that I loved. And actually, I still continue to work with. They're all investors in my company and a few of them are on my board. So it's like I never left. But after 9 years in, I realized I was really good at it, but I didn't care. In the sense that I was an options trader. It went well. I was good. I was kind of moving along in my career, but I felt like I had learned a lot, but I was very curious about sort of the world. And I had sort of grown very fascinated by food security. And I had seen the role that data and information had played in transforming energy markets, where, to me, and it hits on a point that Bob made, which is the power of markets and the efficiency of markets cannot be underestimated in driving change and in funding innovation. And I had seen sort of the evolution of a world where if it was an oil producer or somebody building out a power plant or anything else, if they wanted to finance that activity, getting money from the markets when I first started, if they wanted to sell that oil 1 year forward, 2 years forward, it was actually very difficult. By the time I left, somebody would have a find and we could finance it 10, 20 years forward for them, which basically gave birth to innovations like shale oil and shale gas, fracking, renewable energy. A lot of that sort of played out. And I had seen sort of how the cost of capital being driven down drove innovation, and that driving innovation sort of grew the markets. It changed sort of the market structure, but it really transformed the markets. And I had realized that we were so far from achieving that with agriculture and food security. And I kept hearing people talk about it, but every time I asked questions, nobody would give me standard answers or data that was standardized. And so when I asked questions, if I got asked more questions, it was like, oh, we're trying to fix a system we don't even understand. And so I realized at some point that my passion was entirely in that. And that, sometimes you have a chance encounter in life like the one I did, which led to a great career, but was not sort of my work. And so I left to really sort of solve for food security. I mean, I didn't know whether I was going to start a company or a nonprofit. I mean, all this work we're doing today was not in my vernacular. It was just a desire to solve for a problem. And I knew information was going to be a catalyst. I didn't know at the time if the data was going to be available or we had to collect it. I didn't know if it was going to be about a few food products or every food product. And I sort of embarked on this journey and sort of really traveled the world, learning everything I could about agriculture. I did crop tours in the US and Asia and South America, Africa. It was kind of like, I call it paid learning. Like I paid myself to just go learn and explore the world. But one of the things that became so clear was that we were so rich in data, but so poor in the understanding of that data. And that was sort of a large part of the breaks. And so it became sort of clear that the company that I was going to build was going to sort of dedicate time and sort of understanding to understanding sort of our Earth's ecology and our human economy, because agriculture ultimately sits at the intersection of the two. And we're so data rich on both sides, but we're so poor in understanding. And so what we ended up doing was building a company that really organized that data, made it sort of digestible. And it touches on, I think, a really sort of important point that Leo made around sort of how do we make climate forecasts and climate data more accessible. It was really sort of around that. But again, with this one aim of really solving for, if we're going to solve for food security, let's start by understanding the system. And at the time, I had no appreciation for the fact that trying to understand agriculture meant understanding our earth and our environment, and it meant understanding our human economy. And so a lot of the data we had in our platform ended up sort of being well beyond sort of the confines of agriculture because of this interrelated nature. And so that's sort of, how I kind of stumbled into it. and now has, it's obviously, as a company, we've grown. I started the company in Kenya, which was not a typical thing to do at the time. I left my career in New York, moved back to Africa, moved to a country I'm not from, and started a company from scratch there. And then we went global. And now I'm actually based in New York, but we really do have a global footprint, and our two core teams are between New York and Nairobi. And are sort of now much more focused, not just on agriculture, but on sort of climate. And that really drove from the fact that a huge part of the climate discussions were always focused around standardization of data. and the availability of data. And all I could think was, we're swimming in it. All we have to do is figure out how to sort of make it understandable. And as a company, that sort of move was a very easy one. And having sort of in-house domain experts already embedded in sort of our AI teams meant that sort of translating that data into different applications that were going to be sort of tied to risk management, which was the start of my career, sort of made, sort of natural sense. But, it was, sometimes you fall into these things.
Wow, so that's certainly an extremely inspirational story, right? Coming into the States as an international student, and have the passion to pursue extremely important topic, right? So this is really certainly something that a lot of our students at Baruch and our alums, and also myself, can very much relate to, because that's how we are where we are. So thank you so much for sharing your journey. So if I can follow up with Sarah first. On kind of the data issue, right? So as it's mentioned, highlighted in the report that you guys contributed to CFTC and Leo mentioned, right? So one of the crucial component in managing climate risk is indeed this data, right? So, when I talk to my friends on Wall Street, that's also kind of the number one complaint they have, which is, the data is pretty bad. So in fact, according to a study conducted by scholars at MIT, so they show that, for example, if you look at the ESG scores about corporations from major rating companies, the correlation is only about 30%. Now, what does this 30% mean? To give you a benchmark for comparison, if you look at the corporate bond ratings, then the correlation of these bond ratings across these three major rating agencies is more than 90%. So as you can see, we have a long way to go before we can get really good data for us to assess the climate risk. To not, that's the first step before we're able to manage and we're able to create products to help investors and corporations to manage this risk, right? So in terms of providing data and analytics to combat climate change, to manage the risk, right? So maybe you can help us to list like one major challenges in this area, and maybe quickly if you can plans of overcome this challenge.
Okay, it's a complicated question, especially when anybody says ESG. I always think of a conversation I had with a very large asset manager sort of early in our journey when we were thinking of how we build financial products around this, where they said, remember, ESG is not an asset class, it's a lens. And imagine a lens where everybody's wearing different glasses, right? So that's your first problem. It's a lens by which there are different policies set by everybody. So there's no sort of consistency in then the glasses we're wearing. The second part of sort of the complexity in this comes in, and if you think of it just from the raw data standpoint, because you can fix the lens issue, but in the raw data, there's two categories of sort of, climate risk that we talk about, right? And the first is transition, and the second is physical. If you think of transition risk, it's the price we're going to have to pay, right? So it's to transition into a net zero economy. Whereas the physical risk is the debt that we are sitting on today that we're going to pay for actions we took 10, 20 years ago, to Bob's argument earlier, which is we're 20 years too late. The effects that we're facing today is us repaying debt from 20 years ago, right? So there's sort of two aspects to climate risk. One is actually a lot easier to work with, and easy I say in parentheses because it's a lot more objective, which is the physical risk, because we're not redefining temperature, we're not redefining rainfall, we're not redefining fires. We are trying to standardize how we think about them, and we're trying to think of how we sort of categorize that data in a way that's digestible to people. And that's both historically, which is weather, as well as sort of long-term, which is climate, right? And so on the physical side, the challenge is much more around sort of the deconstruction of the understanding of the science of sort of these environmental parameters. And if you think of data as basically the world sharing its experience, and you think of it as a chronicle of sort of the past, the present, and the future, the past and the present are certain. And so we know that we can quantify it. We've quantified it in the past, and the present is also certain. The future is probabilistic, right? It's probable. We don't know what's actually going to happen. One of the things that's really hard with physical climate risk is helping people understand the probability distribution of outcomes that come with different levels of action that we take as society, right? And so first is like, we as people are not trained to think in probabilities. We're trained to think in certainty, and climate change is literally all about uncertainty. So the first is sort of making that uncertainty more visible and helping people understand. So companies like Grow have spent a lot of time sort of standardizing that physical risk data and helping people understand both the cost of action, or like what you save as a result of taking action, and the cost of inaction. Now, on the transition side, it's more complicated because it's the actions that each sort of individual we take as citizens, as companies take, or governments take to transition to this net zero economy that's going to cost us something. And that's where sort of a lot of the template around the standardization of the data hasn't even been set properly, right? So we have to start agreeing on what matters. And this goes to sort of that lens in the ESG and putting that lens on the same like level, because the data is there. It's not a lack of the data, but what there is an inconsistency in sort of agreement around what to report and what not to report, and what is important and what is not important, and how we sort of build that up, right? So I think those are two very important categories. And I think on transition risk, that is really where policy can play a huge role, because some of that impetus really does have to come from regulators and from policymakers as much as it's going to be people volunteering. Whereas on physical risk, it's an actual outcome that we're measuring. And even as sort of the forecasting science continues to get better, which by the way, it's actually quite good when you back test this data and you see it under different CO2 scenarios. These models are not as bad as most people think they are, which is why I'm more terrified than most people, because I actually see the numbers, but is sort of helping people understand that. So, you know, just think of data as transition and physical risk, two different sets of challenges, two different sets of actors, but ultimately the two do depend on one another.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much, Sarah. Okay, and then my next set of questions will be towards Bob and Leo. So Bob, as the expert in how to manage risk in financial sector, right? So where do you see the possible major regulation changes in terms of disclosure, in terms of stress testing that may be coming in the near horizon, and what kind of companies in the financial sector will be more susceptible to such risk, and what's your recommendations for them, how to expect these changes and to cope with those changes?
Okay, well, our CFTC report is a great place to start. We have 53 specific recommendations in that report, really addressed to all the different regulators in the different markets, whether it's insurance or banks or non-financial institutions. We have a lot of specific recommendations, but basically the foundational finding that we had in the report is that financial regulators and market participants are both going to have to recognize that climate risk poses serious risks to the U.S. financial system in the future, and we need to move urgently and decisively to measure, understand, and address these risks. Now, one of the difficulties is that the risks that are being faced, many of them are location specific. So if you're on the East Coast, at a very low sea level, elevation, you have sea level rise issues to worry about, and storms, hurricanes. If you're in California, here where I am, you may be more worried about wildfires because of the droughts and the hot weather. And in the middle of the country, you worry about floods and hailstorms. And and freezes like we saw in Texas a few weeks ago. So these are very location specific. And then if you think about different sectors of the economy, if you're in oil and gas, you face one set of issues. If you're a utility, you face a different set of issues. If you're a steel company or a cement company, another set of issues. And there's all kinds of opportunities. So if you're a battery company or a wind or solar, you know, or hydro or nuclear, these industries are all affected by climate change, but they're different factors. And so what's really difficult, as Sarah was getting at, is, you know, decision useful data. Where the world is full of data. But if you're a bank or an insurance company or a cement company, how do you gather that data and how do you report it in a way that investors and asset owners and others can make use of that data? It's not a simple problem at all, but it's a problem that we have to solve. And really, the key to understanding it and keeping ourselves moving in the right direction is risk management. You know, one of the things that helped this committee come to consensus is the fact that we kind of understand in the financial markets what risk management is all about. And it's not about expectations. You know, one of the issues here is that scientists, for the most part, think about what is the expected outcome. And even in terms of climate change, you know, we run these different scenarios, business as usual scenario, or a rapid transition scenario, or an intermediate scenario. And then scientists, you know, try to extrapolate what are the implications of those different levels of CO2 in the atmosphere. Well, when you're doing risk management, you're not interested in the expected outcome. What you're interested in is what's the worst case scenario. And one of the things we know from financial markets is that you rarely know what the worst case scenario is. I remember when I first came to Goldman Sachs and we had a swap business, and the co-chairman of the firm said to me, "Bob, how much could we lose?" I was like, you know, there's no answer to that. There's a probability distribution, right? And so in the financial markets, we get very used to looking at the tails of distributions and asking about, you know, what's the, you know, 1 in 100 scenario or the 1 in 1,000 scenario. And one of the problems with climate change is the 1 in 1,000 flood is now happening every couple of years, or the 1 in 100 flood is happening every year. So these probabilities are changing. These are emerging risks, and it makes it difficult. And the data we need are data about the tails that we just don't have. And there's no good way of getting that data. So this is a really tough problem, but it's one that we all have to make progress together, and we have to work on it. And part of that, you know, I would say one of the more unusual aspects of the CFTC report is that we had representatives of all these different corporations come together and being asked by the government, you know, what should we be doing? And the answer was, we need leadership from regulators. We, the regulated companies, need leadership from the regulators to help us provide information that is, you know, comparable and decision useful. So that means, you know, scenarios that are consistent across different venues. You know, the Europeans and the US, let's get some coordination here. We said that was one of our themes. We need coordination across countries globally because, you know, we have lots of global financial institutions, and we want them to, you know, do it once and do it in a way that's meaningful, and then provide that disclosure, the disclosures that are necessary. So I think all of that was very helpful from the report.
Thank you so much, Bob. So in fact, indeed, this is extremely important for the institutions to manage these risks. So in fact, I just taught my class, investment analysis undergrad class. This week, we talked about scenario analysis. We talked about tail risk, how to measure it, and we talked about value at risk measures. So this is excellent material for my students as well. Now, just a quick follow-up question with you regarding regulation, right? So obviously, I completely agree with you that more disclosure is extremely important. It's important for the companies to make the right decisions, imagine the risk for the investors to see what's happening, right? But you know, on the other hand, as an economist, by the way, we're known as kind of the two-handed economists because we often say on the one hand and on the other, right? So the other hand is that regulation is costly, right? So in particular to, regarding to your earlier example, right? So for example, with sea level changes, right, it's going to affect the property values of a lot of coastal area, real estate markets, right? And the local banks, they're going to have a heavy exposure to this risk, right? So more so than the kind of the more global and the diversified banks, right? But these local banks, the financial institutions, they're also typically much smaller, and therefore to come up with these kind of risk management system and to prepare this kind of disclosure could be very costly. So how would as a regulator, right? So how do you balance these kind of trade-offs and provide, guidance to these smaller financial institutions?
Right. Well, you're certainly right that it's a trade-off, and the subcommittee recognized that, and the regulators do recognize that, and so we want to make it as easy as possible and as inexpensive as possible to disclose what are material, climate-related risk metrics. And the fact that disclosure costs you something does not give you a free, measure to say, no, I'm not going to do it. You have to do it, but it should be done in an efficient way and in a way that makes the decision useful. There's no sense disclosing information if it's not useful. And I would say, it's not just the regulators. Asset owners need decision useful information as well. And one of the things that we said is very important is that corporations recognize that asset owners want them to be aligned with a rapid transition to a net zero, or however you want to put it. But and so asset owners are asking corporations to disclose, what is their business plan? Is it aligned with a rapid transition? And what are the metrics? How are we going to assess if you're on target? And not just getting, it's easy to say I'm going to be carbon neutral by 2050. And lots of corporations are making that pledge now, which is good. But then the question follows, okay, how are we going to know if you're on track? What are you doing between now and 2025, so to speak? And how am I going to make that assessment? So these are all the right questions. Asset owners are asking them, regulators are asking them, and corporations are understanding that they need to address these. When I left Goldman Sachs 10 years ago, we didn't have the same kind of resources devoted to climate change that we have now. In fact, we had very little in those days. I have a feeling we didn't want to offend, some of our fossil fuel clients. But today, all the investment banks are, competing with each other to help corporations, first of all, get on that alignment with rapid transition, and then also to disclose it. So it's wonderful to see the change in the environment these days, and I mean the business environment as it focuses on these issues, where it was certainly not focused 10 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Bob. Okay, so now I want to ask Leo one more question before we turn our question to ask our students. So Leo, right? So we are talking about you have a wealth of experience in terms of international climate regulations, right? So given that in some other countries like EU, they have been much more, they're like on the forefront of this engagement in terms of climate, right? So what are the main lessons we can learn from international regulators, and to some extent that where we can do similar things, or to what extent we are actually different? And any insights on that would be great.
Sure. We're all trying to solve a similar problem. And you can see across the world, the different regulatory authorities are grappling with the same challenge in different ways, oftentimes talking to one another through forums like the G20, like the NGFS, which brings together central banks and other regulators. And I think what they're discovering after doing this for about 5 years is first of all, that this is hard work. This is cutting edge work, and it involves incorporating into traditional financial and economic analysis parameters related to climate change that, including some of the ones that we were discussing a bit earlier, that are just not traditional part of the backgrounds of economists and financiers and risk managers. And so trying to incorporate those new ideas into models and into frameworks is part of the challenge. However, that's happening already. We see it especially in Europe, which is farther ahead. And the question for us really in the United States is what can we learn from what others are doing? How do we engage now after 4 years of relative, certainly governmental absence from those conversations? How do we bring that forward? What kind of role does the United States want to play in the development of these frameworks, of these disclosure standards, these different taxonomies for defining what is green and what is not green, what is climate friendly, what's not? And I think that's going to require a process with including with stakeholders, the private sector, to understand how to achieve that. What we, I think, ideally do not want is a system or a world in which you have a patchwork of different standards, different rules about what is climate aligned, which would be very confusing to the market. You would have essentially regional markets operating under different rules. And I think most folks agree that that's costly, it's confusing. It's not ideal for the market efficiencies that Bob was talking about. So the question for us then is, well, how do we engage the European approach? What is the best way to find a system that works given all of the particularities of the American legal and institutional framework, right? So that's part of the homework that we're going to have to engage with in the coming years. But what is very clear is that the stakeholders want us to do it, and it's very clear also from the president down that this is something that's going to be at the heart of the administration's work. The new nominee for chairman of the Securities and Exchange Commission, who will have a big role in this, already said last week in his confirmation hearings that he would like to see more disclosure on climate-related risks. And as he starts if and when confirmed, he will start that process, I'm sure, along with other agencies and parts of the government that are tasked with thinking about these issues. So we'll work together on that. And of course, we'll continue to draw on the Cftc report, which has, I think, a long shelf life, given that it really looked forward in a way that other reports hadn't.
Okay, thank you so much, Leo. So it looks like there is a lot of exciting development that's currently happening, and potentially a lot of opportunities for people who are, who will be able to contribute in this domain. So, actually, we're actually running a little bit behind. So, what I will do is I'm going to open up for Q&A, and I would actually like to start the Q&A with the first question on behalf of our students. So, Linda, do I need to do anything for you to start Q&A? Okay, so I'm assuming the answer is no. Okay, so I'll just go ahead. Okay, so first a little bit of introduction of Baruch and our students. So Baruch, we have more than 18,000 students across 3 main schools. So these are the Weizmann School of Arts and Science, who hosts this webinar, the Ziegling School of Business, which I am at, and the Marx School of Public and International Policy. So, and also we are the US #1 school in terms of diversity in student bodies. And then in fact, when I look at the attendee list prior to our webinar, a lot of them are our students, faculty, and staff members. So given that our students major in a variety of different areas, right? So in arts and science, in finance, in business, and they want to be, financial market players, entrepreneurs, and policymakers, scientists. I would like to get your advice for our students on the following questions. So what are the ways in which our diverse student body can contribute to the field that you are actively engaged in? And where do you see where the career opportunities are for our students with different training in different subjects? And how should they prepare themselves? And in addition, what would you like us to do, what would you like to see being taught in universities? So any one of you can take a first jab.
You want me to start? I can give it a shot.
Sure.
So it's the climate action space is very broad, and as somebody pointed out here in the chat, it's very complex, and so it can be a bit overwhelming in terms of how folks who want to make a contribution can start. Right? Where do they start? And in our book on resilience, we identified sort of three types of roles that are, I think, missing or are in short supply. One of those is what we call silo breakers. These are folks who are able to talk to folks outside of their own discipline or their own sector, people who can talk across different boundaries of professional communities. And that is folks who, for example, can be in government but talk to the private sector. These are folks who are maybe climate experts but can talk to health experts about health-related implications of climate change. These are, architects and engineers who can nevertheless talk to policymakers about climate and how that affects the built environment, right? So it's these folks who are able to cross borders, if you will, in the discourse that we need, because climate touches everything, and there's many conversations going on about climate, but they tend to be trapped inside the specific professional vocabulary and conferences and journals of the lawyers and the engineers and the public health experts, and we're not getting a truly cross-disciplinary conversation. And so people who can do that will be in high demand. The second is translators, very relevant to this conversation. These are people who can literally take sophisticated models and climate information and data and explain to policymakers, to business leaders, to small town mayors what it means for them and what it means for their decision making. And that is often in short supply because people who tend to be extremely good at crunching the numbers are not necessarily good at explaining in simple terms to the layperson what they mean. And that is going to be super important to make this all work. And finally, communicators, people who can really, we should call it communicators, should have been persuaders, people who can persuade communities to take some of these, to make some of these investments in resilience, to take some of these steps forward, especially when they include trade-offs. We give the example, for example, in the book about the mayor of Hoboken, New Jersey, who after Hurricane Sandy, Superstorm Sandy, had to persuade the residents of her city to take some federal funding and build some flood protection infrastructure. Many people were opposed to that because even though it would have protected the city from another bout of flooding, it cut off some of the views of from the homes. It was sort of unsightly and kind of ugly infrastructure, and nobody wanted that. They were afraid it would hit their property values. And so she was able to persuade folks, persuade the engineers to change the designs a bit, make them more livable and more user-friendly. And she was able to persuade her residents, her constituency, that this was worth doing. And in the end, they were able to take the money. So you need those types of people who can persuade communities and companies to take on some of these risks, these measures, even though they might appear to be initially on first inspection unattractive, because a lot of these investments are going to have to be done now, and they might seem, like Bob was saying, improbable tail risks that you shouldn't worry about. But then how do you persuade people that in fact they should be worried about them, and that in fact there are things they can do about them? So those types of roles are in short supply, and I would encourage your students to think about how they can develop the skills they need to be able to fill some of these particular roles.
Thank you. And Bob and Sarah?
Sarah, do you want to go ahead? All right. Well, that was an excellent answer, Leo. I have to say, I do agree with you on that. I don't have a lot to add. I would say, I would underscore that what's really rare is to find someone that not only has tools, mathematical tools, computing tool skills, and so on, but can apply them in different, domain areas. And so being able to cross those kinds of intellectual boundaries is really rare and really important, as is the ability to communicate complex ideas, and persuasively to people. So I, I have to say, I totally agree with Leo, and I see Sarah seems to agree as well. The one thing I would perhaps add to that is that I think, for students, what's really important is getting on the job experience. And so, your first job, whether it's an internship or whatever, is very important. And what's important is not so much which company you're with, but rather how much, I would say, building up your own human capital. How much can you get, learn and incorporate, and then move and use it in your next job, and so on. So I just think that that's really important, and especially for students who come from diverse backgrounds and may not have the connections to get that first job. I think there are definitely a number of organizations out there that can be very helpful in terms of getting, especially in the finance community, getting placed. Girls Who Invest is one that I know. SEO is another one. And the Twigo Foundation, I think, is a third. So these are organizations set up to help diverse students find jobs, and I think that's one place to look as well. Sarah?
I mean, there's not much to add after what Leo said. It was like a perfect summary that could really be applied to any subject matter is sort of what I like, which is you can be a silo breaker and a technical person, or you can be a silo breaker and a policy person. You could, so to me, in every one of those facets, right? Because it's ultimately, we experience climate change as humans. And so it's sort of across the spectrum. And, one thing I always say is, like, it almost doesn't even matter what you study, right, at the end of the day. And so to answer maybe your question, Lynn, around sort of what are the things that, we should encourage more of in terms of from an academic standpoint, I always just think that, like, critical thinking is an actual skill, and a class is in like huge undersupply. And I just fundamentally believe that complex real world challenges are critical thinking challenges that will touch and span on so many different areas and aspects. And so it's sort of the grappling with complexity in whatever way it manifests itself. I'm always shocked, for example, when I talk to high school students, critical thought was an actual class that was a requirement to graduate from high school. It's no longer the case. And so just sort of thinking of, like, what are the ways in which we can do interdisciplinary classes, and what are the creative ways in which we can encourage that? Because I think solving for these really complicated challenges means teams and companies that don't resemble what we currently have in place. Like, one of the things I've really focused on and sort of building Grow has been, like, how do we build a company that resembles the future, not the company even that I worked for, right? And so that was really about sort of really embracing diversity in a new way, which you touch on at Baruch, which you're already blessed with in terms of your student body. But it's, how do you get that communication to happen across that diversity? Because the magic happens in that sort of communication across the board, whether it's across disciplines or across languages or nationalities, finding ways to sort of harness that as an academic institution could be, I don't know, one of the things that's interesting. But I think to the question of students and, the types of careers, you could take a career. I think there was a time when, if what you wanted to do was work around climate and climate change, if you wanted to join a big company, you'd be part of a foundation or a very small corporate social responsibility initiative that didn't have much budget and people didn't really pay that much attention. Now, every company, it is a topic that every company and every organization, public and private, cares a lot about, and a lot of resources are going to it. So really sort of also thinking that and understanding that like every facet of society is going to be touched by this, and we're all changing the way we work. And so there is going to be a role that you play no matter what sort of path you take.
Lynn, you were on mute.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah. So this is extremely helpful for our students, so that every one of them can feel that they could potentially contribute to this extremely important issue. And so I also have a question from our alum, Megan. So Megan asked, what can we do as parents to help counteract and turn around this climate class? And so she also put in parentheses saying that our children are highly concerned, well-read, sensitive, caring, informed, animal lovers, nature lovers, geography lovers. What positive empowerment steps and solutions can we offer to make a positive change and also offer hope to our children?
Well, I'll offer a hopeful answer, which is once we create those incentives to reduce emissions, the economy is off to the races. We will all be moving in the right direction. I'm hopeful and optimistic that we will quickly reduce those emissions, that we will quickly figure out ways to pull that pollution out of the atmosphere, and and we'll get past this just like we've gotten past lots of other problems. But we've got to get on that road, and we've got to get those incentives in place.
I would add a couple of things. I think one is the power of example is hugely important. Of course, kids notice very much what their parents do and how they respond to challenges. And so even the small things, whether it's recycling, saving energy, and becoming engaged in the political process, these are things that will become very much engraved in the minds of the children as they grow up. And hopefully we'll find inspiration in that. Even though individual action, by itself is not going to change the system, it nevertheless has an impact in leading by example. And I think that has a real potential to help change how people think. And the other, I think, is to support education in climate-related areas, right? And to frankly celebrate those who choose to focus their career, whether it's college or even electives in high school, right, in a way that brings us in the direction of solutions. So I think there's a lot the parents can do.
Okay, so these are excellent suggestions and advices. Just follow up on Leo's last point, more support on education in climate-related areas. So certainly that's exactly what we are doing now as part of the climate action series to increase their awareness and try to engage more people in this initiative. So would there be more, support from the government in terms of funding of some of these educational programs?
Well, the FY22 budget is getting developed as we speak. I think you'll see that the president's budget request will very much reflect many of his priorities. I only am exposed to a relatively small sliver of that budget. It's a very large thing, as you know. But I expect that there will be considerable support certainly for science-based public policy. Already there's also another executive order on this subject. And I think you'll see that how the federal government spends its money will increasingly be aligned in ways that help promote informed public policy and to support our science and education backbone, which is so essential to American innovation. So, I think it's going to be a pretty optimistic period in that space.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Leo. So I'm going to also just ask one more question for Sarah. We have one of our students, Fatou Kendrick. So his or her question is that in particular, what artificial intelligence Africa can utilize to develop agriculture, and in what ways Africa can fight against climate change. Sarah, you're muted. Yeah.
Yes, sorry, I just realized I was muted after I started talking. I was saying that two very loaded questions. Let me start with the AI for agriculture, which is a little easier, oddly, because AI for agriculture in Africa is no different than AI for agriculture in the US or Brazil. The scale of agriculture is different, but it's the same system. And actually one of the things, that had me grow a global company from sort of start, like from, our mindset, even if we were solving for African food security, is the recognition that African farmers are still part of a global system. And so the way in which you use artificial intelligence for sort of agriculture and enhancing productivity in agriculture is sort of the use of the same technologies, but actually understanding the interdependencies that exist to unleash the capital, drive down the cost of capital. To me, ultimately, this is not going to be solved by giving farmers more information. It's going to be solved by making the system around the farmers more efficient so that they can have better access to capital and tools and whatnot. And that's just part of a sort of a global optimization process. And it's really something that I, when I look forward and to sort of grow and people say, how will you measure success? It's when you see sort of the number of, the dollars of outstanding loans to the agricultural industry in Africa growing on a commercial scale, so that it's not just dependent on donor, funding, for example. So really sort of driving that change. In terms of climate change, Africa is in a very sort of complicated space because it's not a large emitter today, but it's disproportionately affected by even the smaller events. Forget sort of the tail events that Bob is talking about. When your sort of starting resources are already low, much smaller shocks can have very detrimental sort of outcomes, right? And so from a sort of outcome standpoint, it's highly exposed. From an emission standpoint, it's sort of a very, very fast growing region because the demographic is young, economic growth is still sort of, is robust even under, barring what happened last year. You're looking at a continent with a median age of 17 and a half years old. It's the fastest sort of growing population in the world. So even just by virtue of population growth and economic growth that comes with that, you're looking at lots of transformation that happens to economies like energy. And one of the things that, has sort of fueled a lot of growth in China and India is coal-fired generation, which we know is terrible from an emission standpoint and is a huge part of the challenge that we're facing today. And so, the trade-offs that Africa is going to have to make, and how are we going to fund that economic growth so that we're not asking of pretty poor economies to make very, very expensive infrastructure investments without the ability to sort of fund it, but also not ask them to make undue sacrifices for society. So that's what I'm saying, like agriculture in some ways is so much simpler. Climate for Africa is going to be sort of probably the biggest challenge that we still have to sort of solve for from a policy standpoint. And I'm glad to see people like Ngozi become, the head of the WTO, because having Africans in prominent international positions as different layers of negotiation start to occur, I think will become important. But I have more questions as it relates to Africa and climate change than unfortunately I have answers right now. So there's an area where people could do work, but I think it's just a huge dilemma.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Sarah. So again, I would like, unfortunately, there's just so much we could talk about in terms of climate change and resilience, but unfortunately, we are running out of time. So thank you so much for sharing your wealth of expertise and experience and sharing your foresight on the major policy initiatives that's going to come up, and how different sectors in the economy, different players in the world is going to be, thinking about how to cope with the changes and manage climate risk. So thank you so much. So with that, I'm gonna give the webinar to Mindy, who again is the fantastic organizer of the webinar.
Well, this has been a spectacular conversation. It's opened us up to so many challenges. It's the intersectionality of these challenges. Something that's happening in one sector is going to affect another. It's hard to pull everything apart, but there's tremendous amount of data to help us understand and kind of put it back together again. When I hear the students are asking these questions, what they're resonating with is the passion of our speakers. The experts that you are bringing to us the cutting edge understanding of how we're going to move forward with our planet. And at the same time, you're bringing your heart and your soul to taking care of humanity and the other species on which we all depend, and this very fragile place that we live. And I feel incredibly grateful that you shared what you're doing with us, and with our students, and also how much of yourselves that you're devoting to this. In addition, I want one of the things that you mentioned, and each of you discussed it in a way, is how are students going to be involved in this? And they are, because they've joined this conversation today and they're asking questions, and they want to know how to enter. And I had a couple of suggestions. They're short, but I want to recommend them, because climate change is critical for us. And listening to the dimensions and the complexities, we need all the students to be involved in doing this. This is a gigantic problem, and everyone has a role. One of the things I would recommend to students in general is that when they have an opportunity to write a paper in literature or in their natural sciences or in physics or in finance or in risk, that they take an opportunity to write about climate, how climate is involved in that issue. If they have an opportunity, if their professors haven't instructed them as to what they have to do, that they take an opportunity. And it reminded me of something that, Sarah, I can't remember exactly what you said, but you had a situation where you knew something, you knew commodities, but you weren't loving it. But when you went back and you were talking about food and food resources, you couldn't get away from that. You had to go around the world to educate yourself because it mattered. And that mattering has now exploded in terms of your understanding of data and how we all need to process the data. And now you're bringing climate information to our agriculture worldwide. So I'm just saying that students should take their passion and their skills and move that forward. That being said, I also want to say that Baruch College has a program that works on the intersectionality of and the intersections that really, I think, Leo, that you were talking about, and certainly Bob is talking about as well. And that is that we have the Baruch Climate Scholars Program that was supported last year by CUNY, now supported by the CUNY Workforce Development Office. We will be bringing in 12 undergraduates, students who are primarily from minority and historically disadvantaged backgrounds, to take a deep dive in climate change. They will have didactic sessions. They will be involved in research. They will be involved in internships. Our students who are doing it this year, some of them have said this has been the most momentous experience of their college career, because that has put them forward into where they see themselves in climate and how they can take their excitement and engagement and make it part of their future. So just to say for the students who are listening, the Climate Scholars applications are going to be available on Monday. We're going to be now spreading out an announcement, and we're hoping that 12 students will join us to be part of this intersectional group, because our students are going to be coming from Weissman, from Marx and Zigland, from the School of Arts and Sciences, from Public Policy, and from Business. And the conversations our students have with each other, and of course, our guest speakers, many of whom are on this webinar today, have really inspired them, as have you. So I just want to say thank you so much to Bob Litterman, to Leonardo Martinez Diaz, to Sarah Menker, for all that you've brought to us today, because you planted seeds that I think are going to live in our students and each of us for a really long time. I want to thank Lin Pang for being an absolutely marvelous moderator. You are just terrific, and I feel incredibly grateful that you took this on. I also want to thank, of course, I want to thank Dean Lang. She has really embraced this idea of We Are Climate Action, and we're so grateful for her enthusiasm. I want to thank especially Linda Haley, who has been orchestrating the multiple details, and she's been doing this for months on behalf of all of us, and I can't thank her enough. Many thanks, of course, also to Anthony Mira and Nicholas Cftc for their marketing and technical skills. And we will keep everybody apprised of our next events like this, webinars. But of course, when you see the applications for the Baruch Climate Scholars, please join up, because that is also the beginning of what we're looking at here. So again, many, many thanks to everyone. This has been spectacular.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Mandy.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, Sarah, Leo, and Rob and Bob.
Thank you.
And Leo, good luck. You have a big job and we're all depending on you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you.